Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome back to the Modding of Isaac with Lyte. Today, we're going to cover active items. But as always, I went with too grandiose of a project, so we need to go really fast. If we want to cover it in one episode, might have to split it in the middle. But what we've got is a rainbow candle, and you can see trailing behind us, it's a little hard to see in this basement, but we've got some little colored splooshes that trail behind us as we walk. That is an effect of this item. And if we activate it, we hold it up, just like we would a normal candle, it jitters a little. I don't really like the way it jitters. We need to work on that for the future, but we're holding it up and animating, holding it up, and then we use it, swoosh, we get a fire that actually changes color as it goes and matches the color of the splooshes behind us. I also don't like that it fires a tear when I fire the thing. We'll look into that later. So we've got two things that we don't particularly enjoy about it. One thing that I love is that if you completely whiff on it, it recharges your item. If you land the shot, you lose your charge. And, well, let's just run into this boss room and see how it goes. Ragman. So what we do is we keep an eye on the color and then go, now's the time. And we deal half of his damage to him. I was a bit late on the trigger. I should have done it sooner. And we might have been able to kill him with just one shot. Now, this candle is not ridiculously overpowered, because if we had hit anything at that point in the color cycle, it also would have lost half of its health. Whether it's a boss, whether it's a fly, whether it's the Hush, it loses half of its life. Poof, half gone. At that point in the color cycle. If we had sent it earlier, we might have gotten rid of 90% of their health. But if we went too far earlier, we might have hit it for like 1% of its health. But that's how this item works. We've got a lot to cover. Let's get cracking. Here we go. We have the overall outline of what our code is going to do. Thanks to Notepad++, I was able to collapse each one of the functions to hide the details of its implementation. We'll go through each of them one by one, but this way you can see all of the things that are necessary to make this mod work. But first, whenever adding an active item, in case you're here for the active item tutorial, you go into items.xml in your content folder. Just like we did for the passive items, you've got the same thing across the top, and then instead of having passive at the beginning of the tag, you have active, followed by the name, then the description, which is the subtitle, the image, and then the max charges. Max charge 4 says it's a 4-room charge. Eventually we'll cover how to do a sub 1-room charge. It's unclear whether it's easy or difficult to do, but I'm confident we can make it happen. And one additional thing that we're going to need for this particular episode, for the way I implemented you holding the candle, is entities2.xml. Because the way that I made the rainbow candle animation was using a custom entity. It might be possible to do it with a customized character animation. You might be able to do it with a custom costume. There are a lot of ways you might be able to do it. The way I did it was with the entity, such that if you want to make custom entities, whether a familiar or otherwise, this is how you add them. This is how you make a thing that exists and can move around. So you start off with entities. The enum2 root is the fundamental location of all of your animation files. I put GFX. If the only things you're using are effects, you can put effects here. It's just where in the directory tree after resources you find this stuff. You don't put this stuff in content with the XML. All of this goes in resources. So it'll look in resources, GFX, and then your enum2 path. So we open this up, entities, we set an individual entity. then it's anim2 path. So that's where you find your anim2 file. That's your animation file that has any of the animations for this entity in it, whether it's moving around, flying around, jumping around, whatever your thing needs to do, you put them all in that one file. In this case, all it is just a single frame of the candle. It doesn't animate, it doesn't move, it doesn't do anything. It's just there. We should probably open up the animation editor. And so this is all there is to my animation. It's just the sprite that is just the ping that we use on the pedestal. I added an animation called hold up because you're holding it up, and then I put it a little above the crosshairs because I'm going to center it on Isaac, so we want it a little bit higher. We don't want to have to calculate how far that is and put it in the center. We just move it up a little. It looks great. And that's really all there is in the animation editor. We added a layer for the candle. It doesn't matter what you call it. We added a frame, and then we set the sprite sheet to it. So when you make a layer, when you hit add, it asks which sprite sheet to use. And for mine, my candle fit perfectly where it was. I didn't have to do anything to it. Okay, so that's our anim2 file. That's where we find it. And then we have a lot of information that does no good for our particular item because it doesn't exist. It's just held there. So it has no HP, it's not a boss, it's not a champion, it has no collision damage or mass or radius or friction or collision points or shadow size or stage HP. What it does have is an ID, which should raise some red flags to you, and a name. So these three things are the most important: the anim2 path, the ID, and the name. I don't know whether or not you can make a custom entity that isn't a variant of something that already exists. I haven't tested it yet. You probably can, but it leads to the potential for overlap with other mods. So there might be a custom entity available to us. I'm just going to take a quick look in the documentation to see if there's one towards the end. No, we've got entity effect and entity text there at the end. So right now, the ID of 1000 is telling us that this is an effect. Effects are like creep and fire. If we make it have no anything, then it's just an image. It doesn't do anything. So that's what we got. We got the name, the ID, the animation, everything else is 0, and we have to put in the gibs. If you leave this out, it crashes everything. So you have to say that when it's destroyed, it leaves nothing behind. You have to explicitly say that. It's a shame, but it's the truth. So that's items in content and entities in content, but our anim2 in resources. Let's get a few of these windows open for us such that we can see that sort of thing in action. So main.lua, content, resources. Our content has two files, our resources, GFX, items, collectibles, the anim2, and the ping. Brilliant. Let's get to the code. As we always do, we start with mod equals register mod and the name. Local game is game. And then we register in mod our collectible rainbow candle. Get the item ID by name of rainbow candle, exactly as you would for a passive item or pretty much anything else you modify. You get the item by name. Super simple, no problems there. Next up, we have RC, which is rainbow candle. It just saves on a bit of the typing. This is where we're going to hold all of the, let's just say, configuration details for rainbow candle. Pickup tail we'll cover later. That's basically for the animation of you walking. Hsv to Rgb. This is a color converter. This converts from hue, saturation, and value to red, green, and blue. because when you're running through the rainbow, you're running through the hues. The saturation and the value stay constant. We just cycle on through the hues. And then the A is for alpha. So you send it the hue, saturation, and value and alpha you want. It hands you back a color in RGB space. That's going to be really helpful later. We have the P effect update, which happens every frame. It checks, it hands them the player, and then you do things based on what the player has. Then the one thing that is very different for active items is we have this MCU's item callback. So we send it to activate rainbow candle because we're sending it like we're filtering by the ID of rainbow candle. The only item that you use that will trigger this function is the rainbow candle. And so this first argument that gets sent is the type of item used, which is pointless because it's only ever going to be rainbow candle. The second thing is an RNG object, so if there's anything random that happens, you can use the seed and the other items that have been used to get the standard amount of, like the standard type of randomness that you're going to want. And then we've seen entity take damage before, but if we're going to do anything that relies on something being hit with flames, we're going to need this callback. And now we know that it sends along 5 pieces of information. An entity for the target, I think it's an integer for the no, 3.5. So it's probably a float for the damage. You have a bit mask for the damage flag, so you know whether or not it's from an explosion or goodness knows what. The source is an entity reference, like an entity ref object. So we'll run into some issues with that later that will make the code a little strange, but the source is not an entity. It's important. The source is not an entity. And then the countdown, I'm not entirely certain how it works. I haven't played around with it enough to know what it does. So these first 4 are the primary things we're going to need. And for this episode, all we really need is target and source. So that's the overall outline. 12 minutes in, this will be great. We got plenty of time. So let's go through the implementation details. So in RC, there are a few things that we keep track of. We keep track of whether or not we have activated the item. It stays active from the time you press the spacebar or whatever you activate your item with until you attempt to fire a tier. That's the active window. Direction is the direction that you're actually trying to fire it and trying to move, and pretty sure direction is just the direction you're trying to move. So once you've hit the spacebar, you can still move, and we want to animate appropriately for that movement. Direction start is when you started walking in that direction. Entity variant. This is another Isaac get whatever by name. So we look in the entities.xml file for rainbow candle and get the variant. So we set the ID ourselves. We do not set the variant. The variant gets tacked onto the end such that if anyone else adds effects, we don't clash with theirs. Okay? Flame. That's going to be holding the entity that we fire out of our candle. Whoosh. Sprite is potentially unused. I was playing around with a lot of things, so we might not actually use sprite. Keep an eye out for that one. And then hue width. That one might not be so self-explanatory. That's how many frames long it takes to get from red all the way around the rainbow back to red. So you can configure this to speed up the cycle or to slow it down. Okay, we'll come back to pick up tail when it matters. The Hsv to Rgb function is just arithmetic. It basically, if your hue is, I should probably tell you, all of these values are between 0 and 1 for hue, saturation value, and alpha. So if you measure hue in degrees, this is 1 over, it's your thing over 360. If you do it in radians, it's that over 2 pi. I'm doing it 0 to 1 because it's more convenient for me. So if the hue is greater than 1, keep subtracting 1 from the hue until it's between 0 and 1. Then if the saturation is 0 or less, it's black and white. It's a shade of gray. So you just take the value and return it for each of the R's, G's, and B's. We don't have to do any other fancy math. And then from here, you break it into 6 sextants. It's like a quadrant, but there are 6 of them. And you return a particular fraction of each color depending on which of those areas you are in and how far into it you are. So you start off at red, you work your way to cyan and back to red along the other side. This is easily available on the internet. Just search for Hsv-2 Rgb, and there are plenty of things on either Stack Exchange or whatnot that give you the code for making that sort of thing happen. So we've got 3 more major functions. We should probably look at use item first, because this is when you hit the spacebar. This is what happens when you press the spacebar. When you've got Rainbow Candle totally charged, you go to use it, you come in here, it activates it, sets RC active to true, grabs the current player, and it spawns an entity. Which one? Our candle, right where the player is. And it sets that fancy little container we had to be that candle. You notice I didn't actually define that in RC. It doesn't really matter that I didn't initialize it here, because I only ever add it here. There might be a little bit of a conflict of interest, but in the end, you could define it in RC or not. It still works all right. It's probably better practice to actually define it. So let's do that. Let's actually put it right after sprite, and we can get rid of sprite if we don't need it. So we activate the candle, we spawn the entity, off we go. So we can't have been dealing damage yet. We haven't spawned a fire. We just have the candle that we're holding in the air. So here we are in on update. This is a callback we use all the time. And there are a lot of things in here. So we need to keep an eye out for what things we need to be doing. So at the very beginning, we've got game get frame count equals 1, and we spawn the items. That's just having them in the first room. Now, the first thing we have in the candle functionality is setting the current hue. I didn't set hue here because it doesn't matter. The first update we get, we will set the hue. You barely have the item yet. It's not going to be having any problems. So we set the hue to be the current frame count, mod the hue width, divided by the hue width. I know that seems all weird and mathy, but it's not so bad. Our hue width is 240, so this takes the current frame count and counts up to 239. 239 and 0. Counts up to 239, 0, up to 239, 0. And then divides it by 240. So it counts, so this hue counts from 0 up to almost 1 and then back to 0. You got that? Because it was counting 0 to 240, you divide that by 240, it's almost 0 to 1, because it only counts up to 239. It'll be ever so close to 1, but it's never quite going to make it. We use this 0 to 1 for determining how much damage we deal, but we don't actually deal the damage. We'll cover that in a moment. So we set the hue every time we come through. If our candle has been activated, so we hit the spacebar, we do a lot of interesting things. We'll be right back to that. We'll save the flame for the moment. Here is the interesting part I wanted to cover. If you have collectible rainbow candle, so if get active item is the candle, we have it, then if get frame count mod 4 is 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, it's just spacing it out. Every fourth frame, this happens. What happens? Well, we make a little bit of creep. It's not really creep, it's actually water splashes. But we go Isaac spawn, in effect, which one? Water splash. What's its subtype? Who cares? Where is it? The player's position. How's it moving? It's not. Who made it? The player. And then we put a colon at the end and say to effect. Because we created an entity here, but we want it to be an effect. Just to be safe, because we know it is one. So if you watch the primer on functions, you know that we call this function and it returns something. Then we take that something and call this function on it. So that entity that was returned, we turn it into effect and throw it into RC creep. And then we take that creep and set its color to be the current hue, which we got right up here between 0 and 1. Saturation of 1, so fully colorful. Value of 1, fully bright. Alpha of 1, fully opaque. Then the 0, 0, false, false is for you want it to last forever. Minimal priority or absolute priority, still not sure about that one. Not gonna fade out and doesn't share with anybody. The most important part is this first Hsv to Rgb, this stuff, which you send up to our function, which returns a color to hand to set color. That's how we get the cute little trailing behind that gives you the indication of how much damage you're going to deal. Okay, so that was get active item. Now let's see what happens when we activate it. So we've activated it. Then we check, is the shooting joystick, so player get shooting joystick, that's a vector pointing in the direction the person is trying to fire. It doesn't actually have to be the analog stick on a controller. It could be the arrow keys on the keyboard. It's just the arrow keys are more limited in the directions they're allowed to actually be pointing. And then we get the length of that vector, and if it's more than some arbitrary small amount, then they're trying to fire. Choo! So did you follow that? You take the player, you ask for the shooting joystick direction, it's a vector, you get how long it is. If it's adequately long, then they're trying to fire and you should act accordingly. Otherwise, you should try to move around. So, if they're firing, it is no longer active, you're done, put the candle away. Entity : remove. This tells the entity that is the candle to stop existing. You're not killing it, you're just making it no longer exist. Player stop extra animation. This will make more sense when we cover walking, but this says stop doing the hold the item up animation. You're done with the candle, put your arms down. Okay? And then we finally make the flame. Once again, it's Isaac.spawn. It returns the entity that is what you spawned. So we start with an effect. We're going to use the blue flame. I like the blue candle flame, and it works very well with changing the color. If you try to change the color of red fire, if you try to make it totally blue, it's going to be black. You tint a red thing with blue, it's all gone. So if you want a true nice flame, you're actually going to want to make an almost white custom entity. But for now, we're just going to use blue. There is no subtype. We spawn it where the player is. And now comes the fun part. We saw how you get the shooting joystick before. Well, now we're going to normalize it. So normalized returns a vector that is of 1 unit in length. So if it's facing straight up, it'll be 0, -1. If it's straight down, 0, 1. Straight to the right, 1, 0. Straight to the left, -1, 0. However, if it's pointing 45 degrees, let's say down and to the right, then it's not going to be 1, 1, because that has a length of √2. Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So if 1, 1 is square root of 2, that's a problem. You need it to have a length of 1. Well, how do we do that? Well, you take square root of 2 over 2 and square root of 2 over 2 and you're good to go, but you don't need to do that math. It'll do it for you. And this way, no matter which way they're facing, you'll get a vector of equal strength. So player gets shooting joystick normalized, gives you a length 1 vector in the direction they're pointing. Now length 1 is really short. It's not going to give you nearly enough velocity. So we multiply it by about 14, which gives you roughly the oomph of the regular blue candle. That's why I had it sitting in the room there, such that we knew how long it was supposed to go. And then we add the player's velocity, such that if you're running along, it gets your movement added to its own. You know that effect where you're running forward and you fire a tier and it goes farther than it would otherwise? It does this. And then we say the player spawned it, and then we make it an effect, just like we did holding up the candle. Or no, when we were making the creep, that's right. So making the flame into an effect because it is one. So we want it to have all of the properties of an effect. Good. So we have an effect that is a blue flame being shot out in the direction you wanted. And then we set the timeout. That's saying you should only exist for 60 frames. If you exist for more than 60 frames, then something's gone wrong. And that will help us later when we calculate a width. But set timeout says stop existing after about 60 seconds, or 60 frames. So 60 frames, poof, you don't exist. And then you set the flame's color, just like we did the little splooshes, using RC Hue into Hsv to Rgb, and then 0, 0, false, false. Same as we've always done. So that's if they are trying to fire while it's active. But you could hit the spacebar and wander around, aim in your shot, aim in your shot. So we need the else. If they're walking around, you do some other things. You've got the current direction, which is player get movement direction. You need to know which way they're moving. So we know which way they're shooting, we know which way they're moving. There is also a movement joystick option, but we don't necessarily need the joystick. We don't need a vector for this. What we need is to modify the animations. So we want a direction. Current frame is the current frame. Simple enough game, get frame count. Easy enough. Now we've got a slightly complicated if statement. If the direction that we think it is not the direction they're currently moving, or the current frame is 20 frames after when we started, or the current direction is nowhere, then you do some things. Now, we initialized RC direction and RC direction start up here. No direction, direction start, frame 1. So if it's different from that, then do this stuff. Or if we've been doing it so long we need to start the animation again, do it. Or if we're not moving at all, restart the animation, because when you're not moving, you don't want the legs moving, so you just keep repeating the first frame over and over and over again. So if any of those three things are true, then player play extra animation. So we want to play an extra animation of pickup, and that's where pickup tail comes in. Pickup tail current direction. We come up here, and we want walk left, walk up, walk right, or walk down. There was a time where I was considering having no direction be just plain old pickup, but that's just no good. It doesn't look right. If you go into the animation editor and go to their resources and you get into the NM2 files, I think it's just plain old player. Yeah, if you go into player, you can look at all of the different animations you've got access to. You've got teleport, you've got walking, you've got pickup, walk up. So that's where they've got their hands up and they're walking around. So that's what I'm using. Walk down, walk up, walk left. Those are the animations we're using, and the pickup tail just lets us use a table to set it up. So we have pickup tail, and then these brackets let you index it with this value. Instead of being .entity, .sprite, .flame, we just send it direction.left, or whatever the direction happens to be, and it pulls the correct thing from this list. So if we send it, current direction is direction.up, it brings me back walk up. So pick up, walk up. And then we set the direction start to be the current frame, we set the direction to be the current direction, such that we can check next frame, are they still doing that? Or are they not still doing that? If they're not, you change it. If they are, you just keep going. After 20 frames, we've run out of animation. We've only got 20 frames of animation here. So when we get to 20, we start over. And then the rainbow candles position is the player's position plus just a tiny little nudge in the Y direction to prevent Z fighting. Because if you have them exactly on top of one another, it doesn't know which one to render on top, and it'll flicker back and forth. So you want to move it slightly in front of them such that it's always on top. So that's what we do when it's active. Then, if the flame exists, we have two situations. One, it has expired. If it gets to frame 60 in its lifetime, you need to charge the candle, because it shouldn't have got that long. If it did, it didn't hit anything. So if it whiffs, full charge. So if you ever need to check how long an entity has been alive, you can just grab the entity and do .frame count, and that's how long it has existed. So if you want to make an enemy that gets stronger the longer it lives, yeah, you can totally do that. But if the flame is not about to go out, then you set its color to the current hue, such that as time goes by, it can change color as it's going. So you can see it change as it flies across the room. It's really quite nice. But we need to check that it's not nil first, because if we haven't spawned a flame, you can't get the flame count, the frame count of the flame. Ooh, that's tough to say. Because if you try to do rcflame.frame count when rcflame is nil, you'll get an error, and it'll say trying to index nil value, and it'll crash. Well, it won't crash, it just will stop running things. And that's no good. So you need to check whether or not it's nil, and if it's not, then you can do things. So that's RC Flame. We already did if you've got it. We've covered when you've activated it. We've covered all of this. So the only thing left is how to actually do what we want it to do. Like, the whole point is to make it deal damage. I know you've been on the edge of your seat finding out how do you get past the Hush's armor. When in doubt, cheat. So I'll explain how this all works, the punchlines at the end. So on damage, so you look at whenever an enemy takes damage. If the flame exists, so RC flame is not equal to nil. So if it doesn't exist, it'll stop right there. It won't even evaluate this second part. Because you're like, Lyte, you're indexing RC flame. Well, it short circuits. If this is false, it doesn't even try to do this. But if this thing does exist, then it'll check, is the source.entity.index. So, like I said before, source is an entity ref. It's not actually an entity. To get the actual entity, you need source.entity, and then you can treat it like a normal thing. And you check its index versus our flame. So basically, we're just checking, is the source of the damage our flame? Okay? If it is, then we do stuff. So if it hits, we remove it. We get rid of the flame. We're not doing multiple ticks of damage over time. We're not doing standard blue candle stuff. If it lands it is done. So you remove it, and then you set it to nil. Poof, it's gone. Then you determine how much damage is done by the hue. Now, you could just have it go 0 to 1. And yeah, you can do that. You can have it just be 0 to 1 and then instantly back to 0. But that tends to be problematic for the experience of doing it, because then it charges up tons and tons and tons of damage and then nothing. Or even worse, it's super powerful and then it gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, and then it's super powerful again. And if you're off by just a tiny bit, the change in damage could be enormous. Using this, where you take the hue and subtract 0.5 from it, and take the absolute value, and then multiply it by 2, it goes down to 0, and then back up to 1, and then back down to 0, and then back up to 1 slowly. It passes through 0.5 each time. So it goes all the way down, slowly back up, slowly back down, slowly back up. I find this to be a better way of doing it. Now, I've commented at something out here because this is what you would normally want to do here. You would want the target to take damage, referencing how many hit points they have, whether maximum or current, and multiply it by the hue damage. So if they've got 100 hit points and the hue damage is 0.5, they now have 50 hit points, theoretically. More accurately, they take 50 points of damage. You follow? That's an important distinction. So you take their health, multiply it by a number between 0 and 1, so it deals either none, half, quarter, 7/8, all of their health, one way or another. It doesn't go beyond their full health, and it doesn't do less than 0. Okay, so takes that damage. Then there's the damage flags, no flags, none necessary. You send an entity reference of who dealt the damage, me, and then the countdown, we just pass through the one that we were given. You'd think this would be the way to go. You just deal the damage to the monster, boom, they take the damage, it's great. Yeah, except for the Hush. Anything that has boss armor has a fancy way of taking damage. I set the hue damage times 10,000, and it still barely touched the Hush. Barely touched him. Might have done maybe 20% of his health. Maybe. So unless he's got tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of health, which still max hit points times, probably I hit him 90% of that, times 10,000. Barely damaged him. So you can't actually rely on take damage for something you want to work on the Hush properly in this way. Instead, you cheat. You just take their hit points and set it equal to their hit points times a number between 0 and 1. And so you completely bypass their armor. You bypass the whole damage taking process. You directly change their health. It just so happens to be going down. You could just as easily have it go up to heal them. So normally, for an ordinary item, you want to use target, take damage, how much, the flags, who did it as a reference, and the countdown. That's normally the way you would do it. And for something like this, you'd set contact damage in the XML file, and you wouldn't even bother with the Lua. But if you're using Necronomicon, that's what you would do. Target, take damage, this stuff. But if you need to cheat, if you specifically want to do things to the Hush or Ultra Greed, hit points equals hit points minus something or times something. Then you will deal the exact damage you mean to. And it won't proc any on damage effects. But the important part here is this return false. We're returning false because we don't want to deal the blue candle damage. It's not what we want. It's not what we aimed for. Now, if you made a custom flame, like we made a custom candle, you could launch a custom flame and just have it work a completely other way. But with the blue candle, you know it's going to proc the damage the way you want to, and then you just say, nope, don't damage them like that. Do what I said. For me, it's really convenient. And it makes sure you don't damage rocks, you don't proc on pots. You still might proc on fires, though. It's worth testing. But that's what there is to it. This episode took about 40 minutes, which is better than I expected. And it shows you all of the things necessary for making an active item, for creating creep, for activating an animation on your character, for creating a custom entity and having it behave in certain ways. There's a smorgasbord of things in this episode. So anybody reading the title likely doesn't know everything that's in here, and if you've made it to the end, you know all of it. I don't know if I'm going to make this code available because some of it still seems a bit on the rough side. So I don't want to necessarily promote using an entity for holding up the candle. I don't necessarily want to promote the activation of the candle the way I showed it here. So this shooting joystick thing, since it still fires, this might not be the canonic way of doing it. So don't want to put code out there that'll last forever. Just use the ideas that you've seen here, look through the documentation, and then start making things that do what you want. This is just giving you an idea where to look for what you need and a way to think about what you need. One tiny little caveat. I know that you're gonna want to make rainbow creep, like real rainbow creep. When you use player creep white here, it doesn't accept the color. I don't know why. It just doesn't. Water Splash loves it. Red creep, no problem. The milk spillage totally loves it. But the white creep, for whatever reason, just doesn't like it. So if you want to make rainbow creep, just don't use the player creep white. But that's all I've got for this episode. I will see you in the next episode of the Modding of Isaac with Lyte.